amazing discourse. I've learned a lot, and hopefully what I'm trying to do in this paper is to connect the past and the present. So maybe we can fill in some of the blanks between all of the papers. I focus mostly on sociology. I know that people focus on refugee archaeology. What else do we focus on? Public health. So I'm taking this from a purely sociological standpoint and applying sociological terminology to the past to see if maybe it will help us to better understand what's going on in Egypt at the end of the Late Bronze, Early Iron Age. That being said, I really like nomads, so I'm glad I'm going after Aaron because what I'm going to also do is look at how nomadism applies to the Libyans who become Egyptian pharaohs. So, with that being said, during the Late Bronze Age collapse, waves of migrants sailed or traveled on foot eastwards towards Anatolia, Mesopotamia, Egypt, and the Levant. The refugees destroyed many of the cities in the Fertile Crescent and built new settlements, creating a forced demographic shift in the eastern Mediterranean. In Egypt, Libyan refugees in the Late Bronze Age, or the Late New Kingdom, were repulsed first by Pharaoh Merneptah and later by Pharaoh Ramses III. Ramses III settled Libyan prisoners of war in Middle Egypt and then hired them as mercenaries, so in a sense tying back to what Aaron was just saying about joblessness. He boasted of assimilating the Libyans, stating, quote, "I turned their tongues," end quote. And that comes from the Merit Saber Stela of Ramses III at Deir al-Medina. This refers to teaching the Libyans to speak Egyptian. Concurrently, waves of Libyans migrated to and settled in the Nile Delta. They eventually either usurped the local populations or created a culturally blended society in these cities. By the early Iron Age, or the Third Intermediate Period, the Libyans had assumed pharaonic leadership. These pharaohs are considered by modern Egyptologists to have ruled during the Libyan period. Recent interest in the Third Intermediate Period has focused on reevaluating both the material and textual evidence. These studies refute the earlier scholarly opinions that the Libyan immigrants, so the Meshwesh, the Labu, from which the name Libya derives, and other smaller Libyan groups completely assimilated into Egyptian society. In ancient Egypt, a foreigner was considered Egyptianized if he or she spoke Egyptian, wore Egyptian clothes, and practiced Egyptian religion. Therefore, according to the priesthood, who wrote the annals and kept the records and the king lists, the Libyan dynasts were considered Egyptian and not Libyan. So this man, Hornacht, who is actually chief of Meshwesh, is wearing Egyptian clothes. He would have been considered Egyptian. He's making a donation skilla, so 100% Egyptian, at least according to the Egyptians. So it is clear that the Libyan invasion and their hegemony during the Third Intermediate Period did nothing to fundamentally change Egyptian core values. While the Egyptians and some early Egyptologists may have considered the Libyan pharaohs as Egyptian, I argue that the changes in politics, religion, and text in Egypt attest to a separate Libyan identity and cultural syncretization during the Third Intermediate Period. Furthermore, by comparing modern relationships between refugees and their host governments, as well as the determination of refugee identity to the Third Intermediate Period, it is possible to extrapolate that Libyan identity in Egypt after the Late Bronze Age is fluid and expressed in a nuanced manner on a micro level and more profoundly on a macro level. Before discussing my main point, I would like to provide a little background of the history between Egyptians and Libyans. This will provide context for the changes that occur under the Libyan pharaohs. Ancient Libya bordered the western edge of Egypt's arable land along the Nile. So everything that is not necessarily including the Fayoum, which was kind of a gray area at times, but everything that's basically yellow was Libya, all the way to the coastline in West Africa. Egyptian records portray the Libyans as the antithesis of orderly Egyptian thinking and ideology. This is because they were mobile pastoralists who traveled not only in the desert and on the North African coastline, but also up and down the Nile River to look for grazing lands for their herds. Libyan groups never settled nor united into one cohesive state because the land they inhabited was too large and geographically varied. This has made attempts to find permanent Libyan settlements before Phoenician and Greek colonization mostly unsuccessful. As of right now, I think we have a couple of drop sites that date to the Late Bronze Age, as well as the seasonally habited settlements, and that's it, I'm looking at the truth. And that's pretty much all we found to date. So, as mobile pastoralists, the Libyans had no need for a written language. Therefore, little information exists from the Libyans about their culture, history, and religion. Most of what is known about Bronze Age Libyans, therefore, comes from the limited archaeology in modern Libya and Western Egypt, and from outside sources, particularly the Egyptian texts. All Libyan groups mentioned in these texts were likely seasonally mobile, clan-based, and pastoralist or agro-pastoralist. They subsisted on some farming, depending on the group, and that doesn't mean they were settled. It means that they sowed seeds and some people stayed and some people left, or that they sowed the seeds and everybody left. So it depended on the group, really. Gathering, hunting, dairy, and trade with Egypt and the Aegean for comestibles. Egyptians recorded the names of the Libyan groups with whom they traded. During the early dynastic period in Old Kingdom, Egyptians interacted with the Chekenu. Later, during the Middle Kingdom, the Chemehu replaced the Chekenu in Egyptian accounts. In the New Kingdom, two previously unnamed groups, the Meshwesh and the Labu, entered and settled throughout Lower Egypt or the Nile Delta. Libyan hegemony began during the late New Kingdom as the Labu and Meshwesh, who migrated, or as prisoners of war, were relocated into Middle Egypt and the Delta. They slowly moved through the ranks of Egyptian military and government. After Ramses III's death in the 20th dynasty, the Libyans began their ascent of power. They married into prominent families and gained the pharaoh's trust. The last king of the 21st dynasty, Susenes II, appointed the chief of the Meshwesh Sheshonq the next pharaoh. This action propelled the Libyans into the royal house and into positions of power in the government, the military, and the temples. Textual evidence documents the Labu and the Meshwesh's rise as well as their settling in the eastern and western Delta cities. Donation stela, such as the one I showed you earlier with the man who was wearing his feather, his name is Hornacht. This attests to the change in demographics. This is seen in their Libyan titles, Chief of the Meshwesh, or Chief of the Labu, which is written on these objects of worship. Libyan interaction and control over aspects of Egyptian daily life soon changed the politics, religion, and culture of the Egyptian state. These factors moved away from an internal focus on the state and became more outwardly focused and kinship-oriented. So politics between the late New Kingdom and Third Intermediate period show one of the biggest shifts in Egyptian history due to Libyan rulership. The Egyptian monarchy stayed fairly stable from its inception during the early dynastic period through to the late New Kingdom. So one king, two viziers, governors, various overseers for different works and projects. And also the very traditional smiting scenes, which I think Shirley actually also showed us too. This hierarchy not only governed Egypt well for 1,000 years and over, but also dictated state religion and state culture. During the Libyan period, a series of principalities were created in Lower and Middle Egyptian nomes or provinces. The kinglets, who called themselves the Great Chief of the Meshwesh or the Labu, pledged fealty to the Libyan pharaoh. So here's our friend Hornacht, who is the Great Chief of the Meshwesh, and he is offering a land grant to the local gods and goddesses, but he's dating through Sheshonq III, who is actually the head pharaoh, the chief pharaoh. So each chief ruled in his nome and was also the military commander. He did use the regular days from the pharaoh and acquiesced to the pharaoh's final judgments. This type of government follows the patterns of a mobile kinship-based government with which the Libyans were well familiar. Each family was organized as a kinship group with one man in charge. This man, who was the equal of others in charge of their own kinship groups, would then pay fealty to a central ruler who would either govern all of the clans or who was appointed in times of need, such as war. This was also attested a lot later during the Roman period, when the Romans went into Libya. So we do see a lot of examples from later texts. This type of multi-tiered system helped to continue the dynastic line and the image of the pharaoh that the Egyptians understood. But it was still something that was comfortable for both groups. This outward shift in the government, however, also affected the focus of Egyptian religious practices. So, like the politics, religion stays mostly consistent throughout Egyptian history. Previously, royalty and the public worshipped both in public temples and in household shrines. The religious pantheon was state-centered. So Horus is the king of the gods, Isis is his mother and the representation, the personification of the throne. Hathor is the goddess of love, but her name translates to the house of Horus, or the palace. Nephthys, whose name means mistress of the house or mistress of the palace, and Osiris, the king in death and the king of the underworld. In the Libyan period, the focus shifted from the state-centric religion to worship of the local known deities. People commissioned personal commemorative stela to the gods and goddesses and donated many different types of votives to their patron deity. So for example, this is one of the chantresses of Amun, who's offering not technically a libation or some food or an Incal life, but she's actually offering her heart to Re-Herakti, which is kind of unusual until later. While the state gods were still revered, they were no longer the main focus of religious worship. Mobile populations would have no need for gathered state worship and instead likely focused on smaller shrines, local priesthoods, and their own relationships with their preferred deity. The great chief of the Meshwesh or Labu in each nome was also the high priest of his local temple. Additionally, at Karnak Temple, focus shifted from the high priest to the chief priestess of Amun, or the divine adoratress. The family related to the divine adoratress held political and economic control over Upper or Southern Egypt. The adoption of the next divine adoratress by the incumbent Karnak priestess facilitated the transfer of power between pharaohs at Tanis, the northern political and religious capital during the Libyan period. Therefore, a pharaoh with a daughter in the esteemed position could wield control over both Upper and Lower Egypt. This transfer of power from priest to priestess may signify more of an emphasis on egalitarianism, or like the modern-day Tuareg, show a more female-oriented society. Because politics, religion, and records in Egypt were connected, the governmental and religious changes affected the amount and type of written evidence during the Libyan period. Previously, the written language was very important in Egyptian culture. I mean, we've been talking about it pretty much for 2 days, so there was a lot of it, right? There are various texts that clarify Egyptian culture, religion, government, daily life. Later on, during the Libyan period, the amount of textual evidence is so scarce that it is impossible to recreate an accurate picture of daily life during the period. Most of the texts were also written in hieratic. This may be due to a mobile population's lack of necessity or desire to create large amounts of text, or their disinterest in using a labor-intensive and complicated script, right? So if we go back to the stela, the Chantress of the Moon has written her text in, part of it in hieratic, actually where her name is all in hieratic. So there is this shift from hieroglyphs, more hieratic than hieroglyphs. The types of texts produced also change. So while the tradition of inscribing royal historical texts on religious monuments or on statuary continues in a limited manner, there are few literary texts dating to the Third Intermediate period. Although I think they have found a few accounts that they are publishing. Unfortunately, they're incredibly fragmentary, so there's really not much to work with here. Most of the official royal texts from this period are similar stylistically to earlier historical accounts. Following Egyptian tradition may have been important to Libyan pharaohs or to the scribes who wrote the texts. However, genealogies become more popular during the Third Intermediate period. Here's an example of one of them. Lineages note family members of at least one previous generation and as far back as 4 generations. This tradition has been paralleled in later pre-Gaddafi Libyan mobile culture. It was common for 2 groups to compare family history for at least 5 generations to ensure common ancestry before conducting business. The modifications in politics, religion, and culture are also bolstered by the written records, which attest to a blending of Egyptian and Libyan cultures. So these changes, which appear, I would say, on a macro level, or maybe even a median level, may be further clarified by modern migration and identity studies. And so I started looking at the Syrian refugee crisis, since there are some similarities here, and the construction of their identity in foreign countries. And what I found, I think, is really applicable to what's going on in Egypt during the early Iron Age, or Third Intermediate period. So for the last 6 years, give or take, the majority of Syrian citizens have been caught in the civil war, right? While many Syrians are internally displaced, and so maybe agreeing or disagreeing with their term of refugee in your own country, whatever you want to do, you do you, Aaron. Others are moving mainly north, south, north or west, sorry, to surrounding nations or traveling across the Mediterranean. And I don't want to recreate that entire conversation, right? The Syrian refugee crisis, of which this is only one, has affected both the host nations as well as the refugees. So, a migrant can be defined as a person who moves to another country for any reason. Okay, so economic crisis, someone who migrates is someone who's moving, if you want to use it in the broadest terms possible. So in this context and in my paper, this term is synonymous with refugee. And I do think it is important that we all define this, and maybe by the end of the day in our discussion come to a consensus on like, migrant versus refugee versus whatever. A refugee, in my paper, is defined as a person who moves to another country due to crisis. So during a forced migration, people who lose access to basic needs move to more salient areas, beginning within their own country. So this is obviously true for the Syrian refugees, many of whom are originally internally displaced persons, IDPs, and who are later considered refugees as they travel to other areas. Cultural identity for refugees shifts to adapt to a different social, and in some cases, geographical environment. There are various cultural identity models, but essentially they all describe the four main cultural changes for migrants, or refugees: additive, subtractive, affirmative, or global intercultural. An additive identity is one where the migrants incorporate aspects of their host culture into their personal narrative. This can manifest as either a bicultural identity, where migrants or refugees have two separate cultural behavior sets and can apply proper social behavior in both their host and their home countries, or as a hybrid identity, which merges both host and home cultures into a different and unique identity. Subtractive identity refers to migrants who are less comfortable with their home culture than with their host culture, while affirmative identity describes migrants who ignore both their host culture and maintain or strengthen ties with their home culture. Global or intercultural identity denotes migrants who have multiple cultural behavior sets and draw on all as necessary. So for my purposes, additive and subtractive identity is most prevalent, at least in Libyan society. Transnationalism is defined as the interaction between the state government and the peoples who live under its jurisdiction, whether or not they culturally identify with that society. This interaction between the government and the population, including refugees, immigrants, citizens, is what creates cultural identity on micro, median, and macro levels. On the macro level, governments have three options for dealing with migrants: assimilation, differential exclusion, and multiculturalism. Assimilation is the act of incorporating migrants into a state politically, economically, and culturally, while differential exclusion discriminates against migrants on the same factors. Multiculturalism recognizes that people living in a country may have cultural ties to other areas, and that this can affect cultural, social, and political change on the macro level and the state level. However, multiculturalism also assumes that the original migrants or refugees will stay and settle in their host country, and will produce children who will be citizens of that host nation. With these explanations, it may be possible to better understand the events surrounding the late Bronze Age, early Iron Age transition in Egypt, and the cultural identity of Libyan refugees in the Nile Delta. There are many discrepancies when I started looking into this, other than migration direction between the current refugee crisis and the Libyan forced migration in the late Bronze Age. And there's a lot, so it sounds kind of discouraging at first. So first, the Libyans migrated due to environmental changes. We have textual evidence from Renepta, who states that the Libyans came camping on the western edges of the Nile Delta, looking for food to feed their bellies. The Syrians migrated obviously due to a myriad of political, economic, environmental reasons, right? There's so many. Second, international policy has allowed for global intervention in the current migration crisis of sorts, but that did not exist in antiquity. Third, modern nationalism is paramount in modern refugee interaction in other countries, yet was not as stressed as in the past. Fourth, today we have access to interviews, and we are able to collect both qualitative and quantitative data about refugees and cultural identity, while we are working with incomplete textual and archaeological sources for past migrations. Finally, Syrian migrants were not a mobile society like the ancient Libyans, which may affect each group's cultural identity formation. However, the first indication of a large-scale crisis migration is evidence of internally displaced people. Farah Renefta noted that, quote, "The wretched fallen chief of Libya has fallen upon the country of Tehanu with his bowmen," end quote. It is clear that the Labu, the Libyan group to which Renefta refers, had moved and seized land belonging to an Eastern Libyan group before attempting to invade Egypt. So there's therefore textual confirmation of an internally displaced Libyan population. As Libyans settled into Egypt, it is clear that some refugees created subtractive identities, while others created additive identities and partially integrated into Egyptian culture and society. Egyptian art preserves confirmation of these cultural identity models. While most, if not all, Libyans portrayed in Egyptian art wore traditional Egyptian dress, some Libyans retained their adornments, such as earrings, ostrich feathers, or even kina sheets. Actually, here's an example of Osarkhan III, who is pharaoh, and you can see the feather at the top of his crown. He's put his feather on even over his symbols of Egyptian kingship. Others kept their Libyan names or their titles. This preservation of Libyan adornment and titulary can therefore be considered a deliberate visual or written display of added hybrid identity by some Egyptian citizens. Government response to refugees and cultural self-identity are not mutually exclusive. For example, differential exclusion, so not incorporating refugees into the politics, economy, or government of a host nation, may not be seen on a micro level, as immigrants, refugees can and have created additive identities. Unlike today, Pharaoh's response to an influx of refugees was assimilation. Multiculturalism had a positive effect on Egypt's economy and its ability to survive the late Bronze Age collapse, unlike other states in the Eastern Mediterranean. Many of the Libyan refugees created subtractive, additive hybrid, or additive bicultural identities seen on the macro level. It is therefore fair to assume that many Libyans created additive, hybrid, or bicultural identities on the micro level as well. And here's a good example of one of those, which may or may not be partially forged or forgery or legit, because we're still tracking down where it was excavated. All we know is that it was sold. So yeah, it shows Princess or Queen Paraama coming out of her tomb holding a land grant, which is an incredibly unique scene if it is an actual real stela. And if it is legit, what does that say about how Libyans are interpreting Egyptian culture as well? If it's forgery, then it's really amazing, and you can discredit it right now, forget about it. We're working on that. So evidence that we do see today, such as camps or makeshift settlements, or like we were talking about yesterday with the more modern forms of use and discard of items from a home culture, may not be visible in the archaeological record. Modern settlements may have destroyed evidence of late Bronze Age camps. These camps may have been located on the fringes of the Egyptian border, such as Renefta stated, or they may not have yet been found or understood in the context of migration. Today, some refugees are given available housing or find rentable accommodations in their host cities, which would create issues with ethnic identification in the archaeological record. These issues may be why it is hard to determine a separate Libyan material culture in Egypt during the late New Kingdom and Third Intermediate period. More data is still needed to fully understand the impact of Libyan additive identity on the micro level. So, parallels between current events and the collapse of the late Bronze Age have caused scholars to reevaluate Egyptian history between the late New Kingdom and the 25th dynasty Kushite pharaohs, who eventually defeated the Libyan kings, and who are noted in the Egyptian sources as being, well, Kushite or Ethiopian, whereas the Libyan kings were just called pharaohs. They were never identified as Libyan. So this shift from Egyptians to Libyans as the ruling elite, I would think, is visible in the transformation of the politics, religious practices, and texts between the late New Kingdom and the Third Intermediate period. Today, the Old, Middle, and New Kingdoms of Egypt can be described as a settled, centrally focused society, visible in the pharaoh-centric monarchy, the state pantheon focused on the divine personification of the king, and anthropomorphic representations of the royal iconography, the conventional artistic canon, and the traditional literary corpus. The Libyan period, in contrast, can be described as a previously mobile population who may have, for the most part, settled, but who still retain culture-specific aspects. This is visible in their kinship-focused politics, their de-emphasis on a central state-mandated religion, their personal representations, and their stress on a genealogy instead of a traditional literary corpus. The Libyan refugees, like many refugees today, identified originally with their host cities. This is evidenced by their local military, religious, and political governorship in various Delta cities. Subsequent generations, however, became citizens of the state, eventually ruling both Upper and Lower Egypt. It seems like today that the Libyan population living in Egypt shows an additive or subtractive identity visible in their titles, names, and ornamentation. Libyan self-identification, however, was of no concern to the Egyptians, who granted citizenship to Libyan immigrants as they learned to speak Egyptian, wore Egyptian clothes, and either practiced Egyptian religion or the seemingly similar and not really so well-defined Libyan religion. The political, religious, and cultural changes during the Libyan period may have also helped the Egyptians to consider the Libyan refugees as assimilated Egyptians. Other examples of Libyan additive hybrid identity in the preceding, so-called assimilated 21st dynasty include the marriage of an unknown Egyptian princess to King Solomon, as noted in 1 Kings 9:16, and I'm not getting into that. But I will say that this anomaly, as well as other instances of deviance from traditional Egyptian cultural behavior, may help scholars to better understand the nuances of ethnic and social identity of foreigners living in ancient Egypt. So a lot of these studies that we're talking about today are fairly new in ancient Egypt. So migration, refugees, even identity and ethnicity as compared to other fields. These ideas are just starting to become mainstream in Egyptian studies. So these facets of history are important to further clarify the late Bronze Age collapse, as they can help us to draw better parallels to today's crisis-induced migration and the construction of identity in a shifting global environment. In addition to using today's refugee crisis to better understand the past, we can also learn from the past to help accommodate refugees and avert today's social, political, and economic crises in host countries around the world. Thank you.